At Christmas dinner, stepmom announced, "You're a disgrace and can't stay here anymore." Next day, I did this. The Christmas tree twinkled in the corner of our grand living room, its ornaments reflecting light across the polished mahogany dining table. My father had insisted on using my mother's antique china, the delicate white porcelain with hand-painted blue flowers that she had treasured. I ran my finger along the edge of my plate, remembering how she used to let me help arrange them for special occasions. "Eleanor, stop fidgeting with the dinnerware," Catherine snapped, her voice slicing through my memories. "Those plates are worth more than what you make in a month." I withdrew my hand quickly, ignoring the sting of her words. My stepmother had never missed an opportunity to remind me of my place in this house since she married my father 3 years after my mother's death. At 32, I should have been immune to her barbs, but each one still pierced like the first. "Sorry," I murmured, reaching instead for my wine glass. My father cleared his throat at the head of the table, seemingly oblivious to the tension. "Shall we carve the turkey?" he asked with forced cheerfulness. Around us sat my father's sister, Aunt Vivian, her husband, Uncle Robert, my 2 cousins with their respective partners, and Catherine's brother, Gerald, who never seemed to have a kind word for anyone but had somehow managed to secure an invitation to every family gathering since Catherine entered our lives. "Before we eat," Catherine announced, smoothing her emerald silk blouse, "I have something I'd like to share with everyone." My stomach tightened. Catherine never shared anything unless it benefited her directly. "Richard and I have been discussing the future of this house," she continued, placing her manicured hand over my father's. "As you all know, this beautiful home has been in the family for generations." 3 generations, I corrected quietly. "My grandmother left it to my mother, who is no longer with us," Catherine interrupted, her smile never reaching her eyes. "And as we look toward the future, Richard and I have decided it's time for some changes." My father nodded absently, the same distant look in his eyes that had been there since my mother died. Catherine had perfected the art of speaking for him, and he rarely contested her. "What kind of changes?" Aunt Vivian asked, always the first to notice when something was amiss. Catherine's smile widened. "We're planning a complete renovation starting next month. New kitchen, expanded master suite, modernized everything." She gestured grandly around the room. "All these outdated fixtures and old-fashioned details will be gone. It's time this house entered the present century." My heart pounded in my chest. The outdated fixtures she referred to were selected by my mother, an interior designer whose taste had been celebrated in local magazines. Every corner of this house held her touch. The custom stained glass in the landing window, the hand-carved banister, the vintage wallpaper she'd sourced from France. "You can't," I said, louder than I intended. All eyes turned to me. "This house, Mom designed everything here. It's her legacy." Catherine's expression hardened. "Your mother has been gone for 7 years, Eleanor. The house belongs to your father now. To us." "But she would have wanted it preserved," I insisted, looking at my father. "Dad, you know how much work she put into this place. How can you let Catherine erase it all?" My father shifted uncomfortably in his seat. "Catherine's right, Ellie. It's time for some updates." "Updates are one thing," I said, feeling heat rise to my face. "But a complete renovation? Ripping out everything Mom created?" The room fell silent. Even Gerald stopped picking at the appetizers to watch the drama unfold. Catherine set down her wine glass with deliberate slowness. "I've been patient with you, Eleanor. For years, I've tolerated your constant references to your mother, your reluctance to accept changes, your subtle undermining of my position in this family." Her voice remained calm, but her eyes flashed dangerously. "But this is my home now, and I will not be made to feel like an intruder in it any longer." "It was my mother's home," I replied, trembling with emotion. "And mine was," Catherine emphasized, leaning forward. "Past tense. Now it's time for you to face the truth that everyone in this room can see. You're living in the past, Eleanor. You're a 32-year-old woman still clinging to her mother's memory, working at a mediocre job, with no prospects or ambitions of your own." The cruel assessment hung in the air. My cousins averted their eyes, suddenly fascinated by their napkins. "Catherine," my father cautioned weakly, but she was already gathering momentum. "No, Richard. It needs to be said. We've coddled her long enough." She turned back to me, contempt evident in every line of her face. "You've become a burden, Eleanor. A reminder of what's gone rather than what could be. This house doesn't need your mother's outdated influence anymore, and frankly, neither does this family." Aunt Vivian gasped. "That's quite enough." "It's not enough," Catherine cut her off. "For years, Eleanor has been living here rent-free, contributing nothing, expecting to be treated like the lady of the manor when that title belongs to me now." She looked around the table, as if seeking allies. "We've all noticed how she undermines me, contradicts me, questions every decision I make. Because your decisions are erasing my mother," I said, my voice breaking. "Your mother is gone." Catherine slammed her hand on the table, causing the fine china to rattle. "And it's time you stopped using her as an excuse for your failures. You're not a child anymore, Eleanor. You're a disappointment. A disgrace to your father's name and everything he's worked for." The word disgrace echoed in the silence that followed. I looked to my father, waiting for him to defend me, to tell Catherine she had crossed a line. But he sat still, eyes downcast, saying nothing. "Dad," I whispered. His silence was worse than Catherine's words. In that moment, I knew I'd lost him completely to her influence. Catherine stood, pointing toward the foyer. "I think it's best if you leave. Not just dinner, the house. Tonight." "You can't be serious," Aunt Vivian protested. "It's Christmas Eve, for heaven's sake." "This is Eleanor's home too," Uncle Robert added, finally finding his voice. Catherine shook her head. "Not anymore. Richard and I have discussed this, and we agree it's time for Eleanor to stand on her own feet." She looked at me with cold finality. "You have an hour to pack some essentials. Tomorrow, we'll arrange for the rest of your things." I looked around the table at the stunned faces of my relatives, at my father who still wouldn't meet my eyes, and finally at Catherine, whose triumphant expression told me she'd been planning this humiliation for a long time. Without another word, I pushed back my chair and stood. The room spun slightly, but I forced myself to walk steadily to the stairs. 20 minutes later, I descended with a single suitcase, wearing my warmest coat. The dining room had emptied, voices murmuring behind the closed door of my father's study. Only Catherine waited in the foyer, arms crossed. "I've called you a taxi," she said curtly. I moved past her to the front door, then paused with my hand on the knob. "You won't get away with this." She laughed, the sound brittle in the cavernous entryway. "I already have, dear. Don't embarrass yourself further by making threats you can't back up." I stepped out into the bitter December cold, the door clicking shut behind me with devastating finality. Snow had begun to fall, the flakes catching in my hair and on my eyelashes as I walked down the path to the street. In that moment, shivering in the darkness with nowhere to go, I made a silent vow. Catherine would regret this night. I would make sure of it. The motel bed creaked as I shifted, unable to find comfort in the sagging mattress. The digital clock blinked 3:42 a.m., mocking my sleeplessness. Outside, snow continued to fall, coating the world in deceptive tranquility while my mind raged with the injustice of what had happened. My phone buzzed, another text from Aunt Vivian. She had been sending messages since I left, offering her spare room, expressing outrage at Catherine's behavior. But I couldn't face anyone right now, not even her. I needed space to process the betrayal that cut deeper than Catherine's cruelty, my father's silence. How could you let her do this? I whispered to the empty room, as if he could hear me. The father I knew, the one who taught me to ride a bike, who read me stories each night, who promised nothing would change after Mom died, would never have allowed Catherine to throw me out on Christmas Eve. But that father had vanished gradually over the years, replaced by a shadow who deferred to his new wife's every whim. When had he become so weak? Or had he always been this way, and my mother's strength had simply masked it? I pulled the thin blanket tighter around my shoulders, my mind drifting to memories of my mother. Julia Martin had been a force of nature, creative, determined, and fiercely protective of both our home and me. When she was diagnosed with cancer, she faced it with the same determination she applied to everything else, fighting until her final breath. "I've taken care of everything, Ellie," she had whispered during one of her last lucid moments in the hospital. "The house will always be yours. No matter what happens, remember that." At the time, I thought she was delirious from medication. My father had inherited everything naturally as her husband. At least, that's what Catherine had explained when she started making changes to the house barely a month after the funeral. As dawn broke, casting weak light through the motel's thin curtains, I sat up suddenly. My mother's words echoed in my mind with new significance. "The house will always be yours." What if she had meant it literally? My heart raced as another memory surfaced, my mother pressing a small key into my hand 2 days before she died. "There's a box in the attic behind the chimney bricks," she had said. "When the time is right, you'll know to look there." I had kept the key on my keychain all these years, never connecting it to anything specific, assuming it was just a sentimental gesture. But now, I threw off the blanket and fumbled for my phone, dialing Aunt Vivian's number without hesitation. "Eleanor? Thank God. Are you all right?" Her voice was thick with worry. "I need to get into the house," I said without preamble. "There's something in the attic I have to find." "Catherine changed the locks this morning," Aunt Vivian replied, confirming my suspicion that my stepmother wasn't taking any chances. "But I still have the spare key to the garden shed. The connecting door to the kitchen never locks properly." 2 hours later, I slipped into the house through that very route, grateful that Catherine and my father were attending their usual Boxing Day brunch with her country club friends. The house felt eerily quiet as I made my way up the 3 flights of stairs to the attic, dust motes dancing in the shafts of light from the dormers. The brick Catherine had complained about as unsightly, the one my mother had insisted remain exposed, protruded slightly from the wall near the chimney stack. With trembling fingers, I pressed against it, gasping when it slid backward, revealing a small cavity. Inside sat a weathered metal box, no bigger than a hardcover book. The key fit perfectly. Inside lay a sealed envelope with my name written in my mother's elegant script, along with a stack of legal documents. I opened the envelope first, unfolding a letter dated just weeks before her death. "My dearest Eleanor," it began. "If you're reading this, then either I've told you about this box, or you've discovered it on your own. Either way, the timing is right for you to know the truth." My eyes scanned the pages, shock mounting with each paragraph. My mother had inherited the house from her mother, as I knew, but what I didn't know was that she had executed a special trust before her marriage to my father. The house had never legally been part of their marital assets. "Your father knows about this arrangement," she wrote. "He agreed to it before we married, understanding that the house would pass directly to you upon my death, while he would retain lifetime residency rights as long as you were under 30. I've left separate provisions for him that should be more than sufficient." I set down the letter with shaking hands and turned to the legal documents. There was the trust agreement with my name listed as sole beneficiary, a copy of the original deed showing the property transfer into the trust, and amendments specifying that my father's residency rights would terminate if he remarried. At the bottom of the stack lay a document that made my blood run cold, a revised will dated after my mother's death, supposedly transferring all her assets to my father. The signature at the bottom was close to my mother's, but having just read her actual handwriting in the letter, I could see subtle differences. It was a forgery. Catherine had somehow created this false will and used it to convince everyone, including me, that my father had inherited the house outright. She had systematically deceived us all, manipulating my grieving father and pushing me out of what was legally mine. As the realization sank in, another document caught my eye, a bank statement showing an account in my name with a balance that made me gasp. My mother had set aside a substantial sum for me, separate from her other assets. Money I had never known existed. "In case of emergency," the attached note read in her handwriting. "Or in case someone tries to take what's yours." I gathered everything with newfound determination, carefully returning the empty box to its hiding place. As I descended the stairs, The house no longer felt alien. It was reclaiming me as I was reclaiming it. My phone buzzed again. A text from Aunt Vivian. Catherine and Richard returning early. Car just pulled into neighborhood. I slipped out the way I had come. Documents secured in my coat, heart pounding with both fear and exhilaration. For the first time since my mother's death, I felt her presence strongly, as if she had anticipated this moment and prepared for it. In the taxi back to the motel, I stared at the passing scenery, seeing it with new eyes. Catherine thought she had won last night, humiliating me and casting me out into the cold. She had no idea that her actions had set in motion exactly what my mother had planned for, the discovery of the truth. The betrayal still hurt, but now it was tempered with something stronger: purpose. Catherine had made a critical mistake in her grand scheme. She had underestimated me, just as she had underestimated my mother. Tomorrow, I would visit Gregory Winters, my mother's former lawyer. The real battle was just beginning. Gregory Winters' office hadn't changed in the 7 years since I'd last visited. The same leather chairs, the same wall of law books, the same scent of lemon polish and old paper. The man himself looked older, his once salt and pepper hair now completely white, but his sharp blue eyes remained as perceptive as ever. "Eleanor Martin," he said warmly, rising from behind his desk to shake my hand. "I've been wondering when you might come see me." I settled into the chair across from him, placing the documents I'd retrieved from the attic on his desk. "You've been expecting me?" He adjusted his glasses, a faint smile playing at his lips. "Your mother was a remarkable woman who planned for every contingency. She made me promise that if you didn't come to me within 5 years of her death, I should reach out to you." He glanced at his calendar. I had it marked for next month. My throat tightened. Even now, years later, my mother was looking out for me. "I found these yesterday," I said, pushing the papers toward him. "I need to know if they're legitimate, and if so, what they mean legally." Gregory examined each document methodically, his expression growing increasingly grave. When he reached the forged will, his jaw visibly tightened. "This," he said, tapping the forgery, "is absolutely not the will your mother executed in my presence. I have the original in our files." He pulled out a folder from his desk drawer and extracted a document that, while similar in format, contained significantly different terms than the one Catherine had apparently presented to the family. "In your mother's actual will, the house was designated to pass directly to you upon her death, with your father retaining lifetime residency rights under specific conditions. Those conditions included that he not remarry for at least 5 years, and that the architectural integrity of the home be maintained." I leaned forward. "So, when he married Catherine, he violated the terms of his residency rights," Gregory confirmed. "According to this, legal ownership should have transferred fully to you at that point, with no encumbrances." "But nobody told me," I said, struggling to process this information. "I've been living there thinking it was his house, their house." Gregory removed his glasses, his expression troubled. "Eleanor, approximately 6 months after your mother's death, your father came to me with Catherine, who he introduced as his financial advisor. They requested all copies of your mother's legal documents, claiming they needed to sort out tax matters." My stomach dropped. "And you gave them everything?" "I gave them copies of what they were legally entitled to see," he clarified. "But I maintain the originals as a standard practice. What concerns me is that apparently those copies were never shared with you, and worse, it appears this fraudulent will was created to supplant your mother's actual intentions." I recounted the events of Christmas Eve, watching Gregory's face darken with each detail. When I finished, he was silent for a long moment. "This goes beyond family disagreement into criminal territory," he finally said. "Forging a will is a felony. If Catherine was involved." "She was," I said with certainty. "My father isn't capable of something like this. He's been different since Mom died. Withdrawn, passive. Catherine makes all the decisions now." Gregory nodded thoughtfully. "Your father was devastated by your mother's death. I witnessed his decline myself. It's not uncommon for grief to make people vulnerable to manipulation." He turned to his computer, typing rapidly. "I'm pulling up property records. Yes, there it is. 3 months after your mother's death, a deed transfer was recorded showing the property moving from the trust into Richard Martin's name personally. Is that even legal? I asked. No, Gregory said firmly. Not without your signature as the beneficiary, and certainly not with a forged will as justification. He continued typing. And here's something interesting. There have been 3 mortgages taken out against the property in the past 7 years, each increasing in amount. That was news to me. Mortgages? For what? Dad's business has always been successful. The mortgages total just over $2 million, Gregory said, eyebrows raised. That's significant debt against a property valued at approximately $3 million. My mind raced. The renovations Catherine keeps pushing for. You think that's where the money went? Gregory shook his head. Construction doesn't explain this pattern. These look more like cash-out refinances, where someone takes equity from the house in the form of money. Catherine, I whispered. She's been bleeding the house dry. It appears so, he agreed. And now that you're approaching 35, when you would gain full control according to the trust even if your father maintained residency rights, they're pushing you out entirely. A cold realization washed over me. She knew. All this time, she knew the house would eventually be mine, and she's been trying to extract as much value from it as possible before I discovered the truth. Gregory steepled his fingers. I've seen this kind of financial exploitation before, especially with second spouses. But this case is particularly egregious because the property wasn't your father's to encumber in the first place. What can I do? I asked, feeling a mix of anger and determination rising within me. Quite a lot, actually. Gregory's smile held no warmth now. We'll file an emergency injunction to prevent any further financial transactions relating to the property. We'll petition for recognition of the valid will and trust documents. We'll demand an accounting of all funds extracted through these fraudulent mortgages. He paused. And if you wish, we can pursue criminal charges for the forgery. The magnitude of what was happening hit me fully. This wasn't just about reclaiming my home anymore. It was about exposing years of deliberate fraud. Will this hurt my father? I asked quietly. Gregory's expression softened. That depends on his level of involvement. If, as you suggest, he was manipulated rather than complicit, a good lawyer could argue diminished capacity due to grief. But Eleanor, he leaned forward, his gaze intense. You need to prepare yourself. Your father may have been more aware than you think. I nodded, swallowing hard. I understand. How quickly can we move on this? I can have the injunction filed by this afternoon. The rest will take some time to prepare properly. He checked his watch. In fact, if you're comfortable with it, I'd like to call Judge Martinez now. She owes me a favor, and given the circumstances, I believe she'll sign the order today. As Gregory made the call, I stared at the fake will, at Catherine's attempt to erase my mother's wishes and my inheritance. In trying to exile me, she had triggered exactly the scenario my mother had prepared for. Within the hour, Gregory had secured an emergency court order freezing all assets related to the property. By evening, formal legal notice would be served to both my father and Catherine. What happens now? I asked as we finalized the paperwork. Gregory handed me a copy of the court order. Now, Eleanor, you go home, to your house. The word home resonated in a way it hadn't for years. My mother had ensured I would always have one, even from beyond the grave. Tomorrow, I would reclaim it. The sky was overcast, threatening snow as I stood at the end of the driveway, staring up at the 3-story Victorian that had been my family's home for generations. In my hand, I clutched a leather portfolio containing everything I needed: the original trust documents, my mother's authentic will, the court order, and a letter from Gregory authorizing me to take possession of the property immediately. David Chun, Gregory's associate and a notary public, stood beside me. Are you ready? He asked gently. I nodded, squaring my shoulders. More than ready. We approached the front door, and I rang the bell, hearing the familiar chime echo through the house. My pulse quickened as footsteps approached. The door swung open to reveal Catherine, immaculately dressed in a cashmere sweater and tailored slacks. Her expression shifted from polite inquiry to cold hostility when she recognized me. "Eleanor, I thought I made myself clear." "Actually, Catherine," I interrupted, surprised by the steadiness in my voice, "I'm here on legal business. May we come in?" Her eyes darted to David, noting his professional attire and the portfolio I carried. Calculation flickered across her features before she stepped back, allowing us entry, but not bothering to hide her disdain. "Richard," she called out. "You'll never guess who's shown up." My father emerged from his study, looking older than he had just 2 days ago. When he saw me, a complex mix of emotions crossed his face: guilt, relief, and something like fear. "Ellie," he said softly, "you came back." "I did," I confirmed, "but not for the reason you might think." Catherine's brother Gerald appeared behind my father, his perpetual smirk firmly in place. Perfect, another witness to what was about to unfold. "Is there somewhere we can all sit down?" I asked, my tone professional. "This concerns everyone in the house." Catherine led us to the living room with obvious reluctance. I noticed shopping bags from luxury stores piled near the staircase and renovation catalogs spread across the coffee table. She'd wasted no time moving forward with her plans. Once we were seated, I opened the portfolio and removed the court order, handing it to my father. "What's this?" he asked, fumbling for his reading glasses. Catherine snatched it from his hands. "Let me see that." Her eyes widened as she scanned the document, her complexion paling visibly. "This is absurd. Some kind of joke." "It's not a joke," I said calmly. "It's an emergency injunction prohibiting any financial transactions related to this property, effective immediately." "On what grounds?" Gerald demanded, his lawyer instincts kicking in. I turned to David, who removed the original trust documents from the portfolio and placed them on the table. "On the grounds that this house never legally belonged to Richard Martin," David explained. "It was held in trust for Eleanor Martin, with conditional lifetime residency rights granted to her father. Rights which were voided when he remarried less than 5 years after Julia Martin's death." My father's face crumpled. "That can't be right. Julia left everything to me. We had a new will drawn up when she got sick." "No, Dad," I said gently. "You didn't. Mom left the house to me, just as her mother left it to her. The will you've been relying on is a forgery." Catherine stood abruptly. "This is ridiculous. Richard, call our lawyer. Now." "I've already spoken with Sanders," I informed them, referring to my father's longtime attorney. He was quite shocked to learn about the forged will, especially since his signature appears as a witness on a document he never saw. The room fell silent. My father looked bewildered, but Catherine's expression had hardened into something dangerous. "You have no proof of these absurd allegations," she said icily. I nodded to David again, who produced the original will with my mother's authentic signature, alongside the forged version. "We've already submitted both documents for forensic analysis. The preliminary results confirm the forgery. But more importantly," I continued, turning to face my father directly, "3 mortgages have been taken out against this house in your name, totaling over $2 million. My father blinked rapidly.
"What?"
"No, that's not possible. We only refinanced once, for Catherine's boutique venture." He turned to his wife. "Isn't that right?" Catherine's mask slipped momentarily, revealing panic before she composed herself. "Richard, don't engage with this nonsense. They're trying to trick you." "The papers don't lie," I said, producing the mortgage documents. $2 million, Dad. Where did the money go?" Gerald shifted uncomfortably, edging toward the door. Catherine shot him a warning glance that confirmed my suspicions. He knew something about this. "Furthermore," I continued, "Mom left a separate account for me that you never mentioned. Money that should have been mine years ago." My father's confusion seemed genuine. "What account? Catherine, do you know anything about this?" "Of course not," she snapped. "Eleanor is making this all up to cause trouble. She's always been jealous of our relationship." I laughed, the sound harsh even to my own ears. "Jealous? Of how you isolated my father from his family. Of how you've been systematically looting his assets, and mine." "This is slander," Catherine hissed. "Actually," David interjected, "everything Ms. Martin has stated is documented and verifiable. And as of this moment," he handed my father another paper, "the court has granted Ms. Martin immediate possession of the property." My father scanned the document, his hands trembling. "This says I have 24 hours to vacate." "That's correct," I confirmed. "Though I'm willing to discuss alternatives for you, Dad. Catherine, however, needs to leave immediately." "Like hell I will," Catherine snarled, abandoning all pretense of civility. "This is my home." "No," I said firmly. "It never was. And those renovation plans you've been making? They stop now. You have 1 hour to pack essential items and leave. The rest of your belongings can be collected under supervision later this week." Catherine turned to my father, her voice suddenly honey-sweet. "Richard, you can't let them do this to us. Tell them they're wrong." But my father was staring at the mortgage documents, recognition dawning in his eyes. "These aren't the papers I signed. This one," he pointed to the most recent mortgage, "I never saw this at all." "Your signature is on it," David noted. "It's not. I didn't." My father looked up, his expression stricken. "Catherine, what have you done?" Catherine's transformation was immediate and chilling. The mask of the devoted wife vanished, replaced by cold calculation. "What I had to do," she said flatly. "Someone had to secure our future while you were wallowing in grief for years." "By stealing from my daughter?" my father asked incredulously. "By taking what should have been ours," Catherine corrected. "That trust was an insult. Julia knew I was coming into the picture. She deliberately set things up to exclude me." The admission hung in the air, damning in its implications. My father seemed to age a decade before my eyes. "You've known all along," he whispered. "About the trust, about Ellie's inheritance. You knew, and you lied to me." "I protected you from Julia's manipulation," Catherine insisted. "She never trusted your judgment, so she tied everything up for her precious daughter." I watched my father absorb this final betrayal, his shoulders slumping. For the first time, I felt pity rather than anger toward him. "The police have been notified about the forgery," I said, my voice softening. "And the bank fraud division is investigating the mortgages." "This isn't going away, Catherine." Catherine grabbed her purse, her movements tight with fury. "You have no idea who you're dealing with," she warned. "This isn't over." "Actually," I replied, rising to my full height, "it is. The girl you called a disgrace just took back what's hers. I suggest you leave now, before the officers arrive to ask about those forged documents." As Catherine stormed out, Gerald trailing awkwardly behind her, I turned to my father. "Dad," I said gently, "we need to talk." Outside, snow had begun to fall, covering the ground in a clean white blanket, nature's way of offering a fresh start. Inside, the real work of rebuilding was just beginning. The grandfather clock in the hallway chimed 3 times, its familiar resonance filling the silence that had settled between my father and me. We sat across from each other in the library, my mother's favorite room, with its floor-to-ceiling bookshelves and the window seat where she used to read to me when I was little. My father looked diminished, hunched in the leather armchair that once made him appear commanding and authoritative. Now, with Catherine gone and the truth exposed, he seemed lost, a man confronting the ruins of the life he thought he had. "I don't understand," he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. How could I have been so blind? I poured him another cup of tea, buying time to temper my response. Part of me wanted to lash out, to demand how he could have chosen Catherine over me, how he could have failed to protect what my mother had built. But the broken man before me wasn't the villain I'd constructed in my mind over the past few days. "Grief does strange things to people," I said eventually. "Mom was your world." He nodded, eyes glistening. "After she died, nothing made sense anymore. Catherine seemed to understand what I needed. She handled everything, the bills, the legal paperwork, the financial decisions. I was grateful not to think about any of it. She took advantage of that," I said, more gently than I'd planned. "She saw an opportunity and she took it. God, Ellie, the things she said to you at Christmas dinner." He pressed his palms against his eyes. I should have stopped her. I should have defended you. Yes, I agreed, unwilling to absolve him completely. You should have. The doorbell rang, interrupting our conversation. David, who had remained to ensure Catherine didn't return unannounced, appeared at the library door. Detective Rivera is here, he informed us. She'd like to speak with both of you. Detective Sofia Rivera was a compact woman with intelligent eyes and a no-nonsense demeanor. She declined tea, but accepted a seat at the library table, where she arranged her materials methodically. I've reviewed the documents your attorney submitted, Ms. Martin, she began. We're taking the forgery allegations very seriously. Falsifying a will is a Class C felony in this state. My father made a pain sound, and I realized he was grappling with the possibility that his wife might go to prison. I've also spoken with the district attorney about the mortgage fraud, Detective Rivera continued. The banks are cooperating fully with our investigation. We've already traced some significant transfers from your father's accounts to offshore holdings. How much? I asked. Close to $1.8 million, she replied, consulting her notes. Most of it moved through a series of shell companies before landing in a Cayman Islands account under the name Thornfield Ventures. My father looked bewildered. I've never heard of any Thornfield Ventures. No, but your wife has, Detective Rivera said. She's listed as the principal. Her brother Gerald serves as the legal representative. I wasn't surprised that Gerald was involved. He'd always struck me as the type who operated in legal gray areas. Have you located Catherine? Not yet, the detective admitted. But we've frozen the Thornfield accounts and placed alerts at airports and border crossings. She won't get far with the money. As Detective Rivera continued outlining the case against Catherine, a commotion erupted from the front of the house. Raised voices, then the sound of running footsteps. David appeared again, this time with alarm evident on his face. Catherine's here, he said urgently, with what appears to be a moving crew. They're trying to enter through the side door. Detective Rivera was on her feet immediately. Stay here, she instructed, heading toward the disturbance with efficient strides. My father and I exchanged glances before doing exactly the opposite, following at a distance. We reached the grand foyer just as Detective Rivera confronted Catherine, who stood directing three burly men carrying artwork from the walls. Mrs. Martin, Detective Rivera said coolly, displaying her badge. I'm Detective Rivera. You're currently trespassing on property you have no legal right to enter. Catherine's perfectly maintained composure finally cracked. Trespassing? This is my home. These are my possessions. Actually, I interjected, stepping forward, they're not. And according to the forensic accountant's preliminary report, most of these artworks were purchased with illegally obtained funds. Catherine's gaze darted between me, the detective, and my father, calculation evident in her eyes. Richard, she pleaded, voice suddenly tremulous. Tell them this is ridiculous. Tell them I'm your wife and this is our home. My father straightened, something of his old strength returning. No, Catherine. The house belongs to Eleanor, as it always has. And you. He hesitated, grief and anger warring in his expression. You betrayed my trust in the worst possible way. Don't be dramatic, Catherine snapped, her vulnerable facade vanishing instantly. Everything I did was for us. That trust was an insult to your marriage. Julia wanted to control you from the grave. My mother wanted to preserve her family legacy. I corrected. A legacy you've been systematically dismantling. One of the movers shifted uncomfortably. Lady, we were just hired to move some stuff. We don't want trouble with the cops. You're not in trouble, Detective Rivera assured him. But I suggest you put down those paintings and leave immediately. The men complied without hesitation, setting down the artwork and filing out the door. Catherine watched them go, her carefully constructed world unraveling before her eyes. Catherine Thornfield Martin, Detective Rivera said formally, I'm placing you under arrest for fraud, forgery, and grand larceny. You have the right to remain silent. As the detective recited the Miranda rights, Catherine's face contorted with rage. This isn't over, she hissed at me. You have no idea what you're doing. I still have resources you can't imagine. No, Catherine, I replied calmly. You don't. Every account connected to you has been frozen. Every property purchased with stolen funds is being investigated. Even your brother has turned state's evidence to save himself. Her eyes widened at this last revelation. Gerald wouldn't dare. He already has, Detective Rivera confirmed, producing handcuffs. He's been very cooperative since we found his fingerprints on the forged will. As Catherine was led away, her composure finally shattered completely. She began shouting obscenities, threats, promises of retribution. The elegant, controlled woman who had terrorized me for years was revealed at last for what she truly was, a cornered fraud facing the consequences of her actions. My father watched in stunned silence, the full magnitude of Catherine's deception finally sinking in. When the police car pulled away, he turned to me, devastation written across his features. I've lost everything, he said hoarsely. My wife, my home, my reputation, and worst of all, I nearly lost you. I took his hand, feeling the tremors that ran through it. You haven't lost me, Dad, but we have a lot to rebuild. He nodded, tears spilling freely now. I don't deserve your forgiveness. Maybe not yet, I agreed, but we'll work on it. As we stood in the doorway of our family home, truly mine now, by right and by law, I felt a curious sense of peace settle over me. Catherine had sought to exile me, to erase my mother's legacy and my place in it. Instead, she had set in motion her own downfall. The ultimate karma wasn't that Catherine was facing criminal charges, though that was certainly satisfying. It was that in trying to take everything from me, she had lost everything herself. And I had finally come home. 1 year later, I stood in the center of the restored living room, watching sunlight stream through the freshly cleaned stained glass windows my mother had commissioned decades ago. The house felt alive again, breathing, welcoming, healing from the years of Catherine's cold presence. After her arrest that winter afternoon, the legal machinery had moved swiftly. Catherine ultimately accepted a plea deal rather than face the overwhelming evidence at trial. 15 years for fraud, forgery, and financial elder abuse, a term that had shocked me when the prosecutor first used it to describe what she'd done to my father. But the label was accurate. She had systematically isolated him, exploited his grief, and drained his assets while gaslighting him into compliance. Gerald had indeed turned state's evidence, revealing the elaborate scheme Catherine had engineered from the beginning. She had researched my mother's assets before ever, accidentally, meeting my father at a charity event, targeting him specifically for his vulnerability and wealth. The calculated nature of her deception had stunned even the seasoned detectives working the case. The financial recovery had been complex but thorough. Gregory had assembled a team of forensic accountants who traced the stolen funds through a labyrinth of shell companies and offshore accounts. Much of the money was recovered, though some had been spent on Catherine's extravagant lifestyle, designer clothes that still hung in the master closet when she was arrested, jewelry I had donated to various charities, and exclusive spa memberships that had kept her looking unnaturally youthful. My father had moved into a small cottage on the property, a gardener's residence my mother had converted into a guest house years ago. The arrangement gave us both the space we needed, him to process his shame and grief, me to reclaim the home that had always been mine. Our relationship remained fragile, a delicate reconstruction of trust that fractured and healed in unpredictable patterns. Some days we shared meals and memories. Other days the weight of his betrayal made even brief conversations impossible. But we persevered, both understanding that healing rarely follows a straight line. It looks perfect, Aunt Vivian said, joining me in the living room. She had been my strongest ally throughout the ordeal, standing beside me at Catherine's sentencing, helping me sort through the physical and emotional debris left in her wake. Mom would love it, I agreed, running my hand along the restored wainscoting. Remember how she used to say this house had a soul? Vivian smiled, the expression highlighting her resemblance to my mother. Julia always had a touch of the mystic about her. But in this case, I think she was right. This house protected its own, kept the truth hidden until you were ready to find it. The doorbell rang, announcing the first guests for the gathering I'd planned, a small housewarming celebration to mark the completion of the restoration and, symbolically, my own renewal. Gregory arrived with his wife, followed by Detective Rivera, who had become an unexpected friend during the long legal process. My cousins came bearing flowers and wine, their initial awkwardness about the Christmas dinner debacle long since resolved. Even David made an appearance, proudly reporting that he'd been promoted to junior partner at the firm after his work on my case. As I welcomed each person, accepting their congratulations and good wishes, I felt a profound sense of rightness settle over me. This was what my mother had wanted, the house filled with light and laughter, a sanctuary for family and friends. My father was the last to arrive, looking more like his old self than he had in months. He carried a small wooden box I recognized immediately, my mother's jewelry case. "I found this in the attic," he said quietly. "Catherine had hidden it away. I thought you might want it for today." I accepted the box, touched by the gesture. Inside lay my mother's favorite pearl necklace, the one she'd worn on special occasions. I fastened it around my neck, feeling its cool weight settle against my skin. "Thank you," I said simply. He nodded, emotion clouding his eyes. "Eleanor, I know I've said this before, but I'm so sorry for what happened. For not seeing Catherine for what she was. For not protecting you, or this house the way Julia would have wanted." "I know, Dad," I replied. And I did. His remorse was genuine, his shame profound. The man who had once been manipulated into throwing me out of my own home on Christmas Eve now lived with that memory every day. "I've been thinking," he continued hesitantly. "With the restoration finished and everything settled legally, maybe it's time I found my own place. Give you the space to truly make this yours again." The suggestion surprised me. "Is that what you want?" He shook his head. "What I want doesn't matter as much as what's right. This house belongs to you, it always did. I just borrowed it for a while." I considered his words, feeling the weight of the decision. "The cottage is yours for as long as you want it," I said finally. "You're still my father. This is still your home too, in a different way." Relief softened his features. "You're more like your mother than you know." Same generous heart underneath all that determination. The comparison warmed me in a way few things could. I squeezed his hand, then led him to join the others. Later, as wine flowed and conversation filled the rooms, I slipped away to the back garden, my mother's special retreat. The spring plantings were just emerging, green shoots pushing through soil she had once tended with loving care. I sat on the stone bench beneath the flowering cherry tree, feeling the evening breeze against my face. In the quiet moment, I could almost sense my mother's presence, not as a ghost, but as a continuation, a thread that connected past to present to future. Catherine had tried to erase that thread, to cut me off from my inheritance, not just the physical house and assets, but the spiritual legacy my mother had created. In doing so, she had triggered exactly the scenario my mother had prepared for, as if Julia had somehow anticipated the threat years before it materialized. "You win, Mom," I whispered to the twilight garden. "You protected us both." From inside came the sound of laughter, pulling me back to the present moment. I stood, straightening my mother's pearls, and turned toward the warm light spilling from the windows of my home. The exiled daughter had returned. The house had reclaimed its rightful owner. And in the end, the triumph belonged to all three of us, my mother, my father, and me, linked forever by love, loss, and finally, justice.